Rees. Burma has been marked by repeated outbreaks of religious and ethnic violence over the last 15 months. The violence has spread from the country's southwestern coast to the Shan Plateau in the northeast. In June 2012, widespread rioting and vicious clashes in various parts of the country between Buddhists and Muslims, largely thought to be Rohingya Muslims, devastated parts of western Burma. This left over 200 dead and many thousands more displaced. Last month, more than 40 people died in another violent clash between Buddhists and Muslims in central Burma. 3 years after military rule ended, are religious and ethnic tensions threatening to undermine Burma's emerging democratic process? Tana Simons has more.
By the morning, this was all that remained. Hundreds of Burmese Muslims fled their villages in the Rakhine state last week as Buddhist rioters torched 70 homes, killing at least 5 people, including a 94-year-old woman. Following the pattern of other bouts of violence in Burma in the past year, the clash is said to have begun with an argument between a Muslim shopkeeper and a Buddhist. Since June last year, 237 people have been killed and 150,000 left homeless in ongoing violence against the Muslim community.
I'm really afraid. I don't dare to go back to my home because they killed the people. I think it's about 5 or 6 people who died that day.
The most recent attack targeted Kaman Muslims, an ethnic Muslim minority, although it's mainly been Rohingya Muslims who have been targeted over the past year. The UN described Rohingyas as the world's most persecuted minority and virtually friendless. The Burmese government and much of the majority Buddhist population consider Rohingyas to be illegal immigrants from Bangladesh and do not give them the same constitutional rights as displaced. Many Muslims have either fled the border to neighbouring Bangladesh or remain in temporary camps. Human rights groups have heavily criticised the government's slow reaction and lack of assertive stance against the attacks.
About 1,000 people approached us. People didn't do anything to protect us. Also, they didn't shoot at the mob.
The new quasi-civilian government is the first to be elected since decades of military rule ended in 2011. A peace agreement was recently signed by a monk previously self-titled the Burmese Bin Laden for his extremist ideology towards the Islamic faith. Buddhist spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, has also made calls for monks to end the violence. The government have said that they have a zero-tolerance policy towards religious violence, but the president's speech during his visit to Rakhine state last week highlighted the mounting international pressure for his government to respond to the ongoing unrest.
Our international reputation was damaged, but our explanation to the United Nations and to countries in our region convinced them to understand us. The most important thing is we shouldn't allow these things to happen again.
Criticism has also fallen on the opposition party led by Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, whose silence on the issue has been interpreted as a fear of losing votes in the 2015 elections. Many feel that the ongoing unrest does not spell good news for the country's transition into democracy. The international community awaits the response to this latest wave of violence, but with no friends to turn to, Burma's minority Muslims continue to live in fear. Tana Simons, Islam Channel.
Well, joining us in the studio to discuss this are Anna Roberts, who's Executive Director of the Burma Campaign UK, Khin, who's President of the Burmese Rohingya Organisation UK, and Peter Carter QC, formerly the Bar Human Rights Committee. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Anna, so what do you think the fundamental thing that's happening here? Is it that the lid has been blown off the society by the end of military rule?
No, that's not what we see, what is happening. I mean, you sometimes see this analysis that, you know, once a repressive regime is lifted, that these sort of tensions rise to the surface. But actually, that's not what we're seeing. First of all, the repressive authoritarian regime hasn't disappeared. We still have a lack of democracy and human rights in the country. But also, the violence that we've seen over the past week is sort of symptomatic of the violence that has been happening for decades, actually, against the Muslim Rohingya minority, but also against a kind of wider ethnic community and religious communities as well in Burma. And we've seen a real failure by the government in Burma to respond to the kind of widespread and systematic violence that has been happening. And sometimes that is an inactivity or inaction by the security forces, but also very credible reports that there's active participation by the security forces in some of these violations as well.
And Tun, what about that? Because that has been part of the reporting, saying that actually the state has sometimes kind of not intervened, but when it has intervened, it's exacerbated the situation.
Well, what we see here, you see, is happening now today, not last month. It's happening since 2012 June, where our Rohingya Muslims minority were targeted first, and we have the reports and we have received quite reliable information. Many Rohingyas were killed, but the government mentioned only 200 Rohingyas killed by, during the attacks. But we have seen that targeted first the Rohingya Muslims, and then they comes up to Burmese Muslim, Khmer Muslims and others. So when we look at what's happening as a whole issue, the government have Muslim elimination policy in Burma, actually. This President Thein Sein government, what he's heading to is, he did not take any action since 2012 June. Instead, you can see his encouragement to the public that he mentioned July 2012 to UN High Commissioner for Refugees that Rohingyas are not citizens of Burma. They are illegal immigrants. The only solution is keeping them in the camps and send them to the third world countries. So the way he highlighted, the way he mentioned to the Rohingya people, it is encouraging to the public and to the anti-Muslim people and also the thugs and the security forces to happen, and it's a kind of incitement, I should say.
Okay,
So,
let me just ask Peter about that. Do you think this is the case, that what we're seeing is a state-sanctioned or even a state-promoted attack on a section of the community?
It's difficult to say, because the reports clearly indicate that there are sections of the armed forces who are participating, and in other cases where they're standing by and not intervening to prevent. Perhaps that doesn't matter so much in this sense, that the President pointed out that this must never be allowed to happen again. And he's absolutely right. It cannot be allowed. The state cannot sit back and allow minorities to be persecuted by other members of the community. The first and primary responsibility of a state is to protect its own civilians and its own citizens and those who live within the confines of the state. And the difficult balance in a state which is moving from repression and autocracy to a quasi-democracy is trying to balance the rights of the majority who share one religion and ethnicity with the rights of the minority who share a different one, without resorting to the kind of repression which we saw before. It's difficult for an emerging country to deal with, but it is important that they commit to protecting the rights of the minority and to committing the forces of the state actively to promote those rights and those protections.
I mean, Anna, okay, so I mean, you're saying that this isn't just to do with the fact that the military rule has kind of at least partially been ended. Is it to do then with an attempt by the old elites to continue to play a dominant role in the society? This wouldn't be the first time we've seen a transition where the old elite has used the divide and rule policy to hang on to as much power as it can.
Well, it's actually a decades-long policy of discrimination against the Rohingya, and a background of religious intolerance and discrimination, not just against Muslims. We also see with the kind of Christian community also in Burma suffer sort of discrimination. So I think you see a sort of state-sanctioned policy of discrimination for decades, and there's been sort of periodic violence in the 70s, 80s, 90s with the kind of mass exodus. Obviously, we saw the terrible violence last year, and the kind of inaction by the government has allowed that prejudice and violence to spread attacks throughout the country. So it's more a sort of continuation of a policy. And I think, you mentioned President Thein Sein's recent speech of a kind of zero tolerance. But I think, again, that's a sort of familiar pattern where we see sort of commitments in speeches, but the reality on the ground is that that is not what is happening. And, you know, that President Thein Sein has really been negligent in his duties to protect the people, because these have been planned and known about attacks. You know, there has been widespread anti-Muslim propaganda that has been circulating throughout the country. There have been meetings that the authorities have known about attacks before they've happened, and they have taken no action to stop those attacks, and indeed in some cases facilitated or participated in them.
So, I mean, we highlighted in the package that it's not just that the government seems to have been reluctant to do anything very much about this, but the opposition doesn't seem to have been too quick off the mark either. Do you think that one of the things that might end this is if there is serious political opposition to it within the country? I mean, from the opposition.
What we see is Aung San Suu Kyi, you know, NLD leader. She is an icon for Burma, and he's respected by all over the world. You know, what we see is in our country, she was respected by everyone. So this is a big. She should have spoken up. You know, instead, you know, she was silent. She could say that, you know, the Rohingya, these people are at least human beings. So the people, the public, the anti-Muslim or anti-Rohingya campaign should not go that way. You know, she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. She should talk about peace. You know, she never speak up. Particularly, you know, with the Rohingya people, we have supported her for a long time, and National League for Democracy, when they won 1990 election, Rohingya parties were alliance with NLD. We have high expectation on her. So unfortunately, we Rohingyas are very, very sad, and we are unfortunate, you know. Aung San Suu Kyi is silent, and opposition, NLDs, other people also not speaking about any single point.
Peter, what do you think about this? Because I mean, one way of a political entity that's developing in the way that Burma is, of establishing these kind of things, is that a serious opposition says this isn't going to continue in the old way. So, I mean, in a way, there's kind of even more responsibility on the opposition maybe than the government. I mean, maybe you think, oh, the government's going to behave like this.
I think that's a very good point, because the aspirations in international law under the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, isn't just an obligation on the states and the rulers of states. It's an aspiration that every citizen is supposed to subscribe to, which means tolerance and according to each the human rights that you would like to exercise yourself. And so it's particularly important, I think, in a developing country, a country which is moving towards democracy, that the opposition demonstrates that it is committed to the rights of minorities and equal rights for all, and a fair hearing for a fair political part, so a fair part in all the political systems for everybody who is within the territory of Burma. And sadly, it's not happening at the moment, and I think there's a bit of political education that needs to take place there.
Adam, do you think this is an absolutely essential element in the way forward? You described quite a long and persistent historical pattern. I mean, the only way that's going to break is if there's domestic political forces that make the cost of continuing in that pattern too high to bear, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, and I think it has been disappointing that the democracy movement has not been sort of more outspoken on these kind of human rights issues. I think there's been a feeling that the situation is so volatile and controversial that speaking out may sort of fuel more violence. But I think that policy has not been effective because the violence has continued and indeed escalated. So there is a need for a leadership. But it's also important to remember that the responsibility for that lies fairly and squarely with Thein Sein. I think also the international community have a really important role to play because all too often we've seen, since the changes with President Thein Sein and some of the reforms that are going on, we've seen the international community take a much more sort of gentle, softly approach with the government in Burma to try and encourage reforms, but that has been at the cost of not speaking out against these human rights abuses. Human Rights Watch released a report earlier this year documenting evidence of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity that have been happening. And the international community has been shamefully silent in terms of responding to that. So we need to see a much more robust response from the international community, pressuring the government to, for example, allow unhindered humanitarian aid, because the conditions for Rohingya internally displaced people are absolutely dire in the camps, and they're not getting the aid that they need. But also, we need to, the root causes need to be addressed. And I think one of the things the international community could do, it has a lot of experience in dealing with sort of religious violence and intolerance and these sort of peace-building initiatives, that it could help the Burmese government who lack that experience. So some sort of international task force or mechanism that could bring in international expertise to try and sort of combat the sort of very widespread prejudice that there is in Burmese society at the moment. We also have opportunities coming up in the international community at the United Nations. Next month they'll be discussing a General Assembly resolution on Burma. And again, there are opportunities there for the UN to take action on this issue. For example, requesting an international investigation into the violence that has happened, requesting more international observers on the ground that may help keep the peace.
I mean, do you think that the international community ought to return to the kind of stiffer sanctions regime that existed, when they were trying to bring pressure on the military over this?
Well, what we see in Burma today is, by international community, they are much praising to the President Thein Sein, and they lifting up all the sanctions, and they are quite closer. They should not be rushed this way, because what currently changes in Burma, what we see is not constitutional change. It's just atmospheric change. And President Thein Sein, what he is reforming is not actually proper reform. It's not genuine reform. So when we look at Rohingya's issue, he mentioned that, when he visited to Europe, he said that there is no plan to review the 1982 citizenship law, which is the Rohingya citizenship was stripped off by General Lewis in 1982. So that kind of policy, and he mentioned that he proposed ethnic cleansing when he mentioned Rohingya solution is only keeping them in a camps and sending them to the third world countries. So you can see a kind of leader, reformer, by taking up international community is a big, I mean, it shouldn't be that way. So the international community should go step by step. When we look at EU conclusion by EU policy, EU conclusion in last year, April 2012, there is a benchmark that for the Rohingya issue, Rohingya status should be sorted out, and 1982 citizenship law should amend. And instead, 2012 June, Rohingya, more than 140,000 Rohingya become IDPs in June and October of violence. And the root cause of the problem is citizenship law issues is not being discussed, did not met at all that benchmark. And international also we are calling for international observers and international investigation to find out what's happening in our country 2012 June and 2012 October, which will stop further attacks and which can bring the real which can provide the real facts what's happening in our country. But international community instead, not taking action, not EU and other countries, they are not is such benchmark. It's not meeting up. Okay. Instead, praising President Thein Sein.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the pictures seems to be emerging from the discussion is really how superficial the reform process has so far been, and we know, looking at other countries, how deep-rooted military states can be. If you think about Egypt or Indonesia, where the process has gone a lot further. How much more do you think would have to be done to seriously damage the kind of what they call in Egypt the deep state, that might begin to change the political configuration?
I think we need to see a lot more accountability. Accountability of the government and the opposition to the citizens, all the citizens of Burma, and accountability to the international community. And I think the first step that the government ought to do to demonstrate its accountability is to demonstrate or to indicate that it is committed to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes the right of citizenship to those who are living within the state. So it would preclude the argument that the Rohingya people are not nationals of Burma and they would have all the full rights of a citizen. And the way in which they could then demonstrate that commitment would be to sign and ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that would give the UN Human Rights Council the right to call for Burma, for the government, to demonstrate that they are progressing the movement towards democracy. It would also bring into account and make accountable the other international communities like the EU, because the UN Council could say, well, there is no progress being made here, or the progress is minimal, and the other states, particularly the Western states, ought to be doing something to try and promote it because they can.
Okay. Anna, what do you think about this? How much should, could or should be done that would actually begin to break up the old deep state?
Well, there needs to be sort of fundamental change, because the changes that we've seen so far have been relatively sort of skin deep and top down. All the old repressive laws that were there in the past are still there. New ones that have been introduced are being applied in a way that is repressing rights rather than giving new freedoms. And of course, you've got that all founded on a constitution that was written by the military dictatorship and brought in during a completely fixed referendum and the sham elections in 2010. So you've sort of fundamentally still got all the old players in power, but with a sort of veneer of the sort of parliament and so on. So there needs to be fundamental reform of the constitution, one, to allow those sort of fundamental human rights, but also, so again, the kind of, if we're looking at the root causes, is to give a certain amount of autonomy to the ethnic groups, because this is a fundamental cause of dictatorship and the denial of rights for ethnic people, including Rohingya in Burma. And,
do you think
that
the
we haven't
opposition's
seen
up to
yet.
the job? Do you think the coming elections and the opposition, do you think they're really kind of cognizant of how far reform would have to go?
I think they're very aware of the scale of the task in hand. Aung San Suu Kyi, while she's been sort of quite positive and participated in the process, is also cautioning the international community not to be kind of over-optimistic and see what is going on here, because there isn't democracy in Burma. And I think one of the fundamental problems for the international reaction to what we're seeing in Burma is that they seem to be confusing a sort of modernisation of the economy with a transition to democracy. Because if we look at the evidence, we look at the constitution that was written by the military dictatorship. President Thein Sein was handpicked by the former dictator Than Shwe to become president. If we look at the actions that they're taking, this is not the actions of a government that is transitioning towards democracy, more like the government that wants to modernise the economy, get international pressure and sanctions dropped, but maintain their sort of, the power both politically and economically to become something maybe more like Russia or China, a kind of normal
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, are you worried that, the Western powers may have exactly the same attitude to this government that they do to Russia and China, which is, okay, they're going the right way economically, there's the whole investment business, let's not kick up too much about human rights?
Well, the way it's moving is a bit worrying as far as what we see, there's Rohingya situations and anti-Muslims and other ethnic groups, what is facing in Burma today. Because, you see, if you look at our situation, it's 1 year over now, we are calling international community, EU, US, UK and other countries in international investigation to send to Arkan, or also international observers to find out what is happening in Arkan
I'm afraid
state.
I'm just going to have to stop you there, because that's all we've got time for, because we run out of time in the first part of analysis. But do rejoin us in the second part of the programme, where there'll be more news analysis. So if you just stay where you are for a moment too.